thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction as to why we chose our strategy of moving our MBA program towards a digital emphasis, and why it's important for you as prospective MBA students and what distinguishes us. So, we think about the landscape of business. We know there's been lots of revolutions. Probably the most important revolution in business was really the one that occurred in the 1850s when we had the Industrial Revolution. And the entire world went through an industrial revolution, some countries later than others. The US and Europe went through it in the 1850s. And to give you sort of a perspective, a historical perspective, prior to the Industrial Revolution, 90% of people lived on farms. After the Industrial Revolution, the majority of people lived in urban areas. So it had a huge impact in a lot of different ways. And if you think about China, China basically did the Industrial Revolution in the last 20 years, moving from agrarian to an urban society. We are in the midst of another revolution, right? A digital revolution, one that is also a major revolution in the way that society, the way that business conducts itself. Maybe not as dramatic as the one in the 1850s, but nonetheless one that we've been living in. All of you have been living in this revolution, and it's still continuing. So we are in a world pretty much that is now being driven by data. And that is the aspect of the revolution that we have today, that it's a very data-driven world. And that has implications for every aspect of business. It has implications for the nature of work. It has implications for the competitive landscape. All sorts of things are impacted when the world becomes a data-driven world. So I want to touch upon some of that today. Okay, so let me ask, and here we're going to start our polling, so if you don't mind, take your phones out. How many of you believe your company is prepared to compete in this digitally driven world? Yes or no? Or I'm not sure. Okay. Wow, pretty good. Pretty good response. Yes, okay. Keeps changing. There is no right answer, right? It kind of depends on your company, but I'm sure all of you who are in companies know that your companies are struggling with this issue of what to do. And it has something to do with the nature of the industry in which your company operates in, how prepared they might be. Some industries have been impacted far longer than others, right? But you basically get an aspect that there's a lot of challenges involved in being prepared for a digitally driven world. Okay, so if we look at where digital technology is occurring in terms of the actual technology, here's a recent slide on where the spending is happening. And if you can read the slide, you can see that the big areas are obviously artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud. That's the areas that are, where a significant amount of spending is occurring right now. Artificial intelligence is kind of an interesting technology. It actually has been available since the 1950s. It's not a new technology. The problem with artificial intelligence is that the computing power wasn't there to fully utilize it. And so now we have much greater capability from processing standpoint. And so artificial intelligence is getting into its own, and it's become the focus of a lot of companies in terms of rethinking how they're going to compete where artificial intelligence is real. So this is where the big spending is happening in Google. This is where the big spending is happening at places like Apple. Outside of the CEO's office, the artificial intelligence unit has the priority of the CEO. This is where they want to invest because this is where the future lies. So it's a huge landscape when we think about digital technology, but it's opening up and going into areas that there hasn't been as much investment as in the past. Okay, so what is the impact of digital? Why do we care about the impact of digital technologies? Well, obviously the first thing is we get connectivity, right? We all live in a connected age. That's nothing novel, but it has had huge impacts because all of a sudden communication, the cost, the ease, and so forth enables mobility. We are in a mobile generation. Nobody is really tied down anymore. And this is the aspect of digital technology that unites the physical and the digital world. Data analytics, which is really the thing that's driving a lot of companies today, is making better decisions because of data, because of processing. Technology evolves, right? So probably the technology we're most familiar with on a personal level is our cell phone. And if you look at the evolution of the cell phone, you've seen in a matter of 2 decades how much the cell phone has evolved. So 1G, this is the Motorola phone, commonly called the brick. It was used by Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street. It weighed 2 pounds, was 13 inches long, and cost thousands of dollars. That was our first generation phone. The only thing you could do on that phone is make a phone call. Okay, we went to 2G. 2G, Nokia dominated that space. It was still pretty much a phone. The only thing you could do in addition to making a phone call was texting. But it was still an analog phone, but the messages were encrypted digitally. So it was a bit faster, a bit more advanced, obviously, than a 1G phone. And then we went to 3G, okay? And 3G is when we started getting what we would call smartphones. The phones that you're used to today, where you actually have internet capability, and where you can actually do things besides phone calls and text, right? So 3G is relatively recent if you really start to think about the evolution of the phone. And we've gone to 4G, and then I threw up the last phone because Apple does not have a 5G phone yet. Amazing. But the 5G is the next stage, right? To go to a phone that has 5G capability. So we see how this evolution occurs, and some of these steps are minor steps, and some of them are more major. Like going to 3G was a huge step on cell phone capability. Going to 4G was probably less so, but going to 5G is the next step that we're in, which is another major step, and we're in the midst of going to 5G. So how big is 5G? Well, I threw up the specs for those of you who are into computing and engineering. You can see the difference. But for a real sense of getting a difference of what this means, I'm going to ask you a question. How long will it take you to download a 2-hour movie on your 5G phone? The answers are shifting, right? You're beginning to think it's the bottom versus the top. Okay, so do we have an answer, sort of the middle? Just to give you a reference point, it takes 6 minutes in 4G. For those of you who have done it on a plane, you probably already know that. All right. Okay, so that changes your answer a bit? Okay. If it takes 6 minutes on your current phone, how long is it going to take if you were actually to get a 5G phone and be in a 5G cell phone area? Okay. All right, got an answer? All right, so we're going to want to know what the answer is. 3.6 seconds. That's big, isn't it? Now you begin to understand why going from 4G to 5G is such a big step. It's radical. And it's radical in a lot of ways because the problem with 4G is there's latency. It's not just that it takes you 6 minutes to download a movie, it's that you sometimes don't even get anything, right? There's latency, there's a hesitation in the response. That's a real problem if you're trying to monitor something live. It's a real problem if you're self-driving a car, because you cannot have latency. Think about it. So latency is an issue that exists with our current networks, which 5G hopes to solve, not to mention the speed issue is obviously a big issue as well. So that's why 5G is, the requirements for 5G, the amount of money that's being spent to upgrade to 5G is enormous. We're talking $200 billion of investment in infrastructure to go to 5G. First country to go 5G, anyone know? Korea. Korea is the first country that went 5G. And even there, they've had problems with rollout because it's not everywhere. China has gone to 5G, but they're not total. And the US has gone to 5G, but it's in selected urban areas like San Diego and LA. I don't think we're yet 5G in Orange County, but soon to come. Samsung has a 5G phone. All right, so technology, okay, what else does it do? Technology changes customer expectations. And this has ramifications that go beyond even digitally impacted industries. So, as a result of technology, our expectations have shifted, right? We want everything to be as clever as Google, as easy as Apple, as immediate as Twitter, as informative as Wikipedia, as social as Facebook, as visual as Instagram, as personal as Amazon, and as entertaining as YouTube. All of these expectations that customers have shifted and have an impact on other industries. In other words, it's going to impact how consumers perceive anything they consume, anything they like a service that they purchase. Your expectations have shifted because of your interaction in a digital world. And the example I kind of use is my son, who's 24. He went to buy his first car when he graduated from college 2 years ago. And he went with my husband. He picked out his car. He was all ready to go. And then my husband tells him that we're going to sit in the sales office and we're going to have to, purchase the car. He's going to lease it. He's got to get insurance. And it's going to take a couple of hours. And my son goes, "What?" He was not used to the notion that it's going to take 2 hours to figure out the paperwork and get it all established so that he could actually walk away with his vehicle. So this instantaneous perspective really comes because of the fact that we've gotten used to this digital age that we live in. So it has implications that go way beyond the actual digital intersection. So digital is really redefining our markets in the sense that the physical world and the digital world are merging. And so we no longer have this separation, when kind of the separation occurred initially, but now we're seeing it actually merge and intersect. So let me ask you another question. Of all the industries that are out there, I've selected 4, which industries will be disrupted the most? And this obviously doesn't have an answer because we don't know yet. But it's a good question to ask, is to ask yourself, which industries are likely to be digitally disrupted? It used to be historically music, entertainment, newspapers, that these were the industries that were hugely impacted. So here we have some other industries that I've thrown up there that have perhaps not been impacted as much. So the question is, which ones are likely to be impacted next? Which of these industries do you think are likely to be impacted the most? Kind of done? Okay. Okay, I think it's interesting that most of you put healthcare number 1 and automotive number 2 and finance number 3. And like I said, there's really no right answer. But everyone's hoping it impacts healthcare, okay? Whether it will or not is another question, because there's a lot of obstacles to making healthcare more digital. But all finance, automotive, and healthcare, I think, are all the big 3. And just to give you a perspective, healthcare is the largest industry in the United States. Automotive is the largest industry in the world. So these are the 2 largest industries that you can even imagine that are going to be impacted. when the industries that has impacted thus far have been much smaller than these two industries. So it's huge, the impact that it will have on the economy and on businesses. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we have digital technologies and how businesses have to evolve. So Netflix is a good example. All of you are probably familiar with it. I'm sure most of you probably stream it. But how many of you remember how they started? Does anybody remember the little red envelopes you would get in the mail? Okay, it kind of dates us, right? You paid a monthly fee, and depending on how much you paid, you got access to one or as many as you wanted, and there was no fines for returning them late. This was basically their business model innovation. They were basically disrupting what was then pretty much a brick and mortar DVD rental business, right? So they started with the mailing, okay, and their key capabilities at that point in time, in terms of a firm, what do they need to succeed as a DVD by mail outfit? What would be their capabilities, if you think about it? Well, they have to have access to content, correct? So they have to go and get licensing for the DVDs so that you can get the movies you want to watch, because that's pretty much what they had was movies or old shows. The other capability they had was logistics. One of the problems with a DVD by mail model is getting your DVD to you by the weekend, because most people wanted it by Friday so they could watch movies over the weekend. And the US Postal Service is not known for effectiveness or efficiency. So how do you make sure that your DVDs are going to be in the mailbox to your customers? Because if they're not, they're going to be upset, right? And there's no mail service on Sunday. So one of the things that Netflix invested heavily in was the last mile. In other words, they built infrastructure so that they could get you the DVD by the time you requested it by doing their own logistics, moving their own DVDs on private charters between major locations. And they had these hubs in major urban areas that had the entire inventory. So they're not shipping from a central location, but they literally had hubs of inventory, and they collected them and sorted them themselves, and then dealt with getting the logistics straightened out. So it was a huge investment to get customer satisfaction. The first leg. That's their first stage. Then they went to the streaming model. And the streaming model was enabled because all of a sudden we all got broadband into our homes, right? Before you couldn't stream a movie because we had very 300 modem lines. You can't stream with 300 modem. Once we started getting high density lines, then the capability of streaming came about. And Netflix adopted this model and got rid of the disc by mail model. The content was still the same. The difference was the delivery. So now their capability had to shift. They no longer cared about logistics, but they cared about the ability to download, right? Having cloud storage, having fast servers. These became capabilities in order for them to compete as a streaming service. When Netflix went to streaming, 70% of the traffic on a given night was Netflix. That's how dominant they were in terms of utilizing the internet. All right, the next model. I show House of Cards because most of you are probably familiar with that. But the next evolution of their business strategy was that they developed their own content. And this was a major step because it required completely new capabilities. Before, they were basically a distributor by mail, a distributor by streaming. They did not create content. They licensed content. Now, they created their own content. And this was a major step for them because they have no capability in this perspective. And they came out with House of Cards. It's probably one that's most famous. Their initial actually was Lilyhammer, but lots and lots of content. Now, what's interesting about this is before they were licensing all of their content, and they still license a lot of content, and they licensed their content from the production houses like Warner, Disney, ABC, you name it. They're licensing content from the existing industry that generates content. They used to have all the Star Wars movies. They had all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, you name it. They had all that content there, all Disney and so forth. Do you think that the producing companies like Disney and Warner's and so forth ever thought that Netflix would produce content? Not in their lifetimes. They viewed Netflix as an alternative distribution channel, not as a competitor. And now Netflix is squarely their competitor. And not only is it their competitor, but it's their largest competitor. To give you an idea of how big Netflix is today, here's where they are. Where are they not? There's only one country where they're not, China. And that's because they're not allowed in, right? They're in 190 countries. To give you an idea of how big they are. Number of subscribers, well, I only have the data from 2017, 120 million subscribers. Their revenue is $15.8 billion. They're the largest player in the market, right? Their market cap is $130 billion. They are by far the largest player in the industry, right? And there's no one even close. Amazon would be number 2, but they're not even close to Netflix's size. So, question for you. In 2018, Netflix had revenue of approximately $16 billion. How much are they going to spend on content in 2019? Some of you think they're going to spend all their sales on content. You're laughing. That means that you're spending all your revenue on content, which means what would happen to profitability? It'd be negative, right? Because there are some costs aside, content costs, because you're also doing other things. All right, so did that change your minds? Well, I'm not suggesting that you change your mind. I just want to point out what you're saying is if you're going to spend that much money on content, there's not going to be anything left, right? All right, so that's the answer. So you guys changed based on my thing. Here's the data. They are going to spend all their revenue on content. It's mind-blowing, isn't it? They have invested heavily in generating content. And they are the deep pockets in the industry. They are outbidding everyone for content. They have hired the best of talent in every direction you can imagine. They have fueled the economic growth in the area of Hollywood. Because everyone wants more content, it has generated more demand for content and upped the price for content. Because it isn't just Netflix going after live content, it's Amazon, and now we have Apple joining the race. There's all these players that want digital content, right? So you have a lot of money chasing content producers, content providers, and Netflix is the biggest one. They have the deepest pockets, so they can outbid anyone, and they have been outbidding. The deals that they've been signing are mind-boggling for people in Hollywood, the amount of money flowing in. And if you're a user of Netflix, you see it, how much content they have. And what's really amazing is if you leave the United States, you'll see Netflix billboards in South America, Brazil, Argentina, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Germany, because they have production studios all over the world generating content. It isn't just US content. So they're generating content in production studios everywhere. So capability-wise, they now have, the biggest capability they have is generating content. And they have an advantage, right? What is the advantage that they have over the traditional studios and production houses?
Captive audience?
Not really. You can walk away, right? You're not tied like your cell phone plan. Think about the advantage that they have over a network or a cable channel or even a movie house, movie production house.
User feedback.
Huh?
User feedback.
User feedback. They know what you watch. That is data, right? The advantage that Netflix has in this industry is they have data that nobody has. The only people that have data like this are their competitors in the digital space like Amazon. They know what you watch. And, you know, it's eerie, right? They're suggesting shows based on what you watch. Okay, so, and they also produce content based on what people watch. So they know, for instance, what the demand is for a horror film or for a chick flick or whatever, and they can generate the content for that demand and then target that content to customers who are interested. This is something that the regular industry has no idea. So if you think about making a blockbuster movie, which costs a lot of money to make, 90% of the time they fail. They're a complete bomb. Movies really actually succeed in winning a large audience. So most of the content that Hollywood generates in the traditional industry is a failure. Think about TV content. How many shows make it to a second season? Very few. And why is that? Because you're shooting in the dark. You don't really know what's going to hit because you don't really know what customers want. You don't have the feedback loop. Netflix doesn't have that problem to that extent because they kind of know what their customers want. So if you're in Spain, there's certain types of romances that are particularly liked, and this is what they target, that type of content. They have specific ideas of what kind of content to create based on the audience that they have. And that's information. Data drives their content generation, so their success at having successful content goes up. And this is why Disney has now done Disney+. You wonder why Disney is doing Disney+. Well, they, despite the fact that they have lots and lots of channels, they own ESPN, for instance, they don't really know what people are watching. And by going direct to you, they can get a better idea of what to make and what to support in order to satisfy customer demand. So an industry that, even though for us it's been digital for a long time, is in the midst of still being disrupted, and that all of the traditional players are now beginning to realize the lack of data is handicapping them when it comes to generating content. Okay, so here's an industry that's on the verge of, well, in the midst of being disrupted, the finance sector. And I throw this up here because one thing that's very interesting about the finance sector is that it involves multiple industries. It's not just banking, it's insurance, it's brokerage houses, it's everything you can think of to do with money. And it's being disrupted in lots of different ways. Yes, we have Bitcoin, but the main disruption that I see is the payment methods. You know, how do you transact? If you think about the function of a bank is basically an intermediary between you and the provider of a service or product that you want to consume. And there is really no reason for a bank to exist other than being that intermediary. And that is an inefficient model in today's digital age. Why do you have to have this intermediary that's going to capture 2 to 4% of every electronic transaction that you make, which is what they do, right? You start to think about it, that's a lot of fee for doing very little. And now that money can be moved digitally, what is the purpose of that? Before, you actually had accounts that had to move physically money, but even that was done digitally, but it was more complex. Now you have this seamless digital transaction mode. You have to ask yourself, what value does a bank really provide? So this is a sector that's being disintermediated hugely. And as you can see, we still don't know who the dominant players are, although in some spaces there are some winners already, like Robinhood, for instance, in the brokerage space. But you begin to see that all of these sectors of the industry are being impacted. The funny one is insurance, okay? I'm wondering how insurance is going to be impacted when young people don't think they need insurance, okay? So you have an insurance industry that is mostly an elderly client, but nonetheless, this is an industry that's also subject to being disrupted. Like, why do you want to do insurance? And life insurance I was talking about for young people, but auto insurance, things like that, can all be digitally done, right? So you start thinking about the traditional players, This space is under disintermediation. That why do we need the traditional players? Why do you need a physical office, a physical agent, right, in any of these transactions? Okay, another big digital disruption is the digital platform. At Mirage, we have a whole school course, selective course about platforms, if you're into understanding the economics of platforms. But they're growing, right? They started in what we call the digital space, like Netflix and so forth. But they're growing in lots and lots of different areas. It's no longer just in the digital world that platforms exist. And this is a very important trend or phenomena because digital platforms impact hugely what goes on in the industry. So how does it change the industry? Well, platforms, the value of an Uber or an Amazon, according to a lot of analysts, is not in their actual sales or transaction, it's in the platform. The value of the company lies in the platform. The platform reduces information asymmetries, is basically what a platform allows. It's an economic issue. And it allows for scale. If you think about a platform, once you have a platform, you can scale it, you can go anywhere. You know, Netflix is a global platform as an example. It can create a powerful brand. Today, everybody knows what Netflix is. They know what Uber is. These are very powerful brands, Airbnb. They're very powerful brands in their space. So out of nowhere, we all of a sudden have a major player in an industry that was dominated by incumbents. And as a result, if you're creating a new brand in a space, the incumbents in that space, their brands go down in value. So it has an impact on everyone in the industry. So if Robinhood is the major brokerage house, online brokerage house, Charles Schwab's brand value goes down. Did you wonder why Charles Schwab's eliminated brokerage fees in response to Robinhood? This is the incumbent reacting to the digital upstart in the industry. So the other industry that I had you think about, auto. Here we have an industry, the world's largest, that is being disrupted because we have new entrants coming in because of technology. This is a very old industry, right? And it's dominated by about 15 companies worldwide. It's a very large industry. Yet technology is enabling new entrants because you no longer have to make cars in order to enter this industry. So let's look at this industry in a little bit of detail. If you look at the traditional capabilities in this industry, what would they be? Well, I kind of have them up there. You have to have appealing design, right? No one's going to buy a vehicle that looks horrid. You've got to have a good design. So design was a very important capability in the industry. You have to have global manufacturing. Large-scale plants, which cost billions and billions of dollars. Very important attribute because we have huge scale economies in this industry. This is the problem that Tesla has, right? They don't have they don't have economies of scale in manufacturing. You need very large volumes to have scale in manufacturing. And the third key capability is branding. You have to have a very strong brand because customers are not going to plunk down $40,000 to $100,000 on something that they don't know what the product is or they don't understand the company, right? If you think about Hyundai entering the United States, it took them 20 years to develop a strong brand, and they had to do that by offering 10-year warranties and so forth because people didn't trust a Korean car manufacturing for a long time. So brand is very, very important in this industry. So these are the three sort of traditional capabilities: design, manufacturing, and having a strong positive brand. You can have a brand that might be negative, but you want a positive brand. So we go to, all of a sudden, in a digital age, self-driving, you have to have different sets of capabilities. Now you have to be able to gather, sense, respond, and utilize data. This was never really a big capability in the industry. In fact, the industry is not really known for being digitally savvy. Despite the fact that cars have had computers on board ever since emission standards came on board, were required in the 70s, it's not a very digitally savvy thing when you compare it to your cell phone. In fact, The nav systems on most cars are inferior to anything on your cell phone, right? The music systems are inferior. You know, you name it, you start thinking about it, your cell phone has more capability in those areas than your car does. So all of a sudden, with self-driving, it's now an integral part of the vehicle. If you can't sense, gather, make sense of the data, you're not going to have a self-driving vehicle. And so here we have an industry that doesn't have a good skill set in this direction. Not historically, it's not where their skill set resides. So if you think about what an autonomous vehicle needs, it's being able to digest data. So all of the players in this industry have had to ramp up to develop capabilities that they didn't have. And they're moving, and you know, it's huge investments. It's going to take time, and some players are more upfront and further along than others. But the investments are huge. Like, just to give you an idea of how much money is being spent in this direction by the industry. General Motors bought Cruise Automation for $1.3 billion, then invested another $1.1 billion in it. Then they bought Sidecar Asset and invested $500 million in Lyft. Audi, Mercedes, and BMW bought Nokia's mapping assets for $3.1 billion. Okay, now why would they buy Nokia's mapping assets? Well, a key part of self-driving is knowing where you're at, right? Which requires GPS recognition of where you're at. Today, we rely on what? What do we all rely on? Google Maps, correct? The auto companies don't want to be dependent on Google Maps, right? Because that means that your ability to self-drive is dependent on a third-party provider of where you are. So the German companies bought Nokia's mapping apps, which is basically Europe, in order not to be dependent on a Google app. To give you a really current idea, Intel, you know, the company that makes chips, just spent $15.3 billion this past year for Mobileye. You know what Mobileye is? It's the chips for the car for self-driving. $15 billion. Because they know that the car eventually will have more chips than any other device that you're going to own. And the chips are different. They're chips to sense and gather data. It's a very complicated thing to make a car self-driving. It's more than visual. That's the issue. If it was just visual, it would be easy. But it's so much more complicated. But here we have an industry that is undergoing a major change in what kind of capability they need in order to compete in an era where cars are likely to be more and more self-driving. And with 5G coming on, that capability will be enhanced, because you really do need 5G for self-driving capability to be trustworthy, okay? Not to have dead spaces. All right, so we talked a lot about changes in business models and changes in business strategies. So here I throw up one that kind of gives you an idea of some different ways of thinking about business models. And 4 examples in 4 different industries, and it's called a freemium. It's kind of free and premium combined is the word freemium. And most of you are probably users of these businesses. If you think about it, each of them provides some service for free. You know, if you use any of the music systems, or if you use Hulu, there's always a free model, and with that you get ads or you get limited content. Like in the New York Times, you can get 10 articles a month for free without being a subscriber. Then if you want more, they have a second model where you pay more, and sometimes they even have a third or fourth model. So in other words, there's a premium level and then there's a basic level. And this is a very successful business model. Most companies have succeeded by drawing in a lot of people for free and then getting the customers who are really enjoy the service to sign up for a premium value proposition. To give you an idea of how successful it's been, I'll give you the example of the New York Times. Newspapers you would not think would be a growth industry, correct? And it isn't. If you look at overall newspaper subscriptions, the number of newspapers in the country, everything is going down. The New York Times, since they have gone with their digital app, have generated a lot more visitors because all of a sudden you can get people out that don't have a subscription. But the most important thing from a revenue standpoint is the subscribers. So in 2013, when they, sort of the year after they launched their digital app, they had roughly 760 subscribers, digital subscribers. Today, they have 3.5 million digital subscribers. This is very impressive given that the industry is in decline. They are literally adding 200,000 subscribers every quarter. That's pretty impressive, and they're paying. Digital subscription's not free. So you have a huge digital subscription driving in an industry that people would say is on its deathbed, right? Nobody reads anymore. Podcast, New York Times has podcasts, but they've gotten subscribers. They have 4.5 overall, 3.5 that are digital. So this model works very effectively, and companies have kind of gravitated to adopting a kind of freemium-based model. So digital technologies require a change in mindset. I'm hoping that I've motivated you to think about how different the world is with digital technologies. And the change in mindset means that you have to think about things differently, right? And one of the things that I stress as a strategy professor is you have to think more strategically about the world, thinking more about what's going to happen, what is the impact of the technology on my industry. Understanding the ramifications of technologies in your industry becomes an important capability. And then figuring out how to generate value with this disruption. Because ultimately, you've got to capture value in order to survive. So, some skills, figuring out what's going to happen in your marketplace. How is the technology going to disrupt the marketplace that I'm operating in? What's it going to do to the incumbents? How are the new players going to come in? Where am I vulnerable? And so succeeding in a digital world means figuring out what's likely to happen and how best to prepare yourself for that, how best to develop the capability. So it's a very different mindset because it really does not rely on the past. Everyone has a mode of operations. You have implicit assumptions. A lot of the implicit assumptions are based on past behavior. And if you do that in a digital landscape, you're going to have wrong assumptions because the assumptions are no longer valid. So this is why strategic thinking becomes so important because the landscape has changed. So our MBA, we decided, as John mentioned, to adopt a digital focus a while ago, given this change in landscape. And rather than just doing it in a few classes, we revamped the entire curriculum. And we started with our core classes. And there's, core classes. Every MBA program has core classes in the functional areas, accounting, finance, marketing, so forth. And you would think maybe marketing, I can see digital being applicable. But we really revamped in every single functional area. Statistics, operations, finance, accounting. Every single one of our core courses has been revamped to address how digital technologies are impacting the nature of that function. And then on top of that, we've gone and offered electives and created new electives that are very focused on operating in a digital world. And I throw up a few of these just to give you a flavor of them. But strategy in a digital age, as an example, and the media and entertainment design disruption are two examples of strategy electives that we've developed just to deal with thinking more digitally in a marketplace, how to operate. One is very industry specific, media and industry, and this one is taught by a former executive vice president at Disney in charge of their digital content. And the other one is strategy in a digital age, taught by an economist who understands the economics of digital. And then we also have a cutting course called Edge, which is taught by Vijay Gurbashani, which is a very popular course where he brings in lots of speakers as well, talking about changes in strategy based on technology. We have a tech consulting course, analytics for tech consulting. And then we also have, as I mentioned earlier, a platform course, meaning that if you want to understand platforms better, because a lot of things are being driven by platforms, we have a course just devoted to platforms. So our entire curricula has really, really changed, and we're really focused on delivering that value proposition in our MBA program. Even if you're not interested in digital, you can't really ignore the impact of digital in your marketplace. So our focus is we want to prepare you for what you are going to likely encounter or what you already are encountering, and give you a degree that is not out of date, not out of sync with the reality in the marketplace. So thinking and basically altering the strategic thinking in your mind to think more proactively about how I can enhance my company's competitive position, how I can better prepare my company for the future. And those leadership skills is what will advance your own career, is being able to provide that value to your organization. So with that, I'll turn it back to John.